1 Samuel Chapter 18. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan became knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him like his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him like his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and he gave it to David, as well as his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went forth, on every mission that Saul sent him he acted prudently. Therefore Saul set him over the men of battle, and it was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. But when the men came home, as David returned from striking the Philistines, the women came out of all the towns of Israel singing and dancing to meet Saul the king, with tambourines and joyful songs and stringed instruments. And the women sang to one another as they played, and they said, Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They ascribe 10,000s to David, but to me they ascribe only thousands. And what more can he have except the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. Then on the next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house while David played the lyre by hand, as he had day by day. And the spear was in Saul's hand. Then Saul threw the spear, for he said, I will strike David even to the wall. But David fled from him twice. And Saul was afraid of David, for Jehovah was with him and had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from being with him and made him the captain of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David acted prudently in all his campaigns, and Jehovah was with him. And when Saul saw that he acted very prudently, he stood in awe of him. And all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, See, my oldest daughter Merab I will give to you as wife, only be valiant for me and fight Jehovah's battles. For Saul said, Let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said to Saul, Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Merab the daughter of Saul was to be given to David, she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite as wife. Now Michal the daughter of Saul loved David, and it was told Saul, and the matter pleased him. And Saul said, I will give her to him that she may be a snare to him and that the hand of the Philistines may be upon him. Therefore Saul said to David, for the second time, You may be my son-in-law today. Then Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David privately, saying, See, the king is pleased with you, and all his servants love you. So now become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke these words in David's ears. And David said, Is it such a light thing in your sight for me to become a son-in-law to the king, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And Saul's servants told him, saying, This is what David said. Then Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king has no desire for a dowry but for 100 Philistine foreskins, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. For Saul planned to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these things, David was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. And when the time had not yet expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and he struck down 200 Philistine men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal his daughter as wife. And Saul saw and knew that Jehovah was with David. And Michal the daughter of Saul loved him. And Saul was even more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy from then on. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and as often as they went forth, David succeeded more than all the servants of Saul. So his name was very highly esteemed. 1 Samuel Chapter 19. And Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, took great delight in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father is seeking to kill you. Now therefore be on guard in the morning, and stay in some secret place, and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand by my father's side in the field where you are. And I will speak about you to my father, and if I learn anything, I will tell you. So Jonathan spoke well about David to Saul his father and said to him, May the king not sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have been very good for you. For he risked his life when he struck down the Philistine, and Jehovah accomplished a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by having David killed without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, As Jehovah lives, he shall not be put to death. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. And there was war again. And David went out and fought against the Philistines. And he struck them with a great slaughter, and they fled from before him. Then there came an evil spirit from Jehovah upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his spear in his hand while David played the lyre by hand. And Saul sought to strike David even to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence. And Saul struck the wall with his spear, but David fled and escaped that night. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If you do not save your life tonight, in the morning you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window, and he went away and fled and escaped. Then Michal took the teraphim and laid it in the bed. And she put a net of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothing. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, Bring him up to me on his bed that I may kill him. And when the messengers went in, there was the teraphim in the bed with a net of goat's hair on its head. Then Saul said to Michal, Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go so that he has slipped away? And Michal said to Saul, He said to me, Let me go, why should I kill you? So David fled and slipped away and came to Samuel at Ramah, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt at Naioth. Then it was told Saul, saying, David is now at Naioth in Ramah. So Saul sent messengers to seize David, and when they saw the company of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's messengers, and they also prophesied. And it was told Saul, and he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul again sent messengers the third time, and they also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah. And he came to the great well that is in Essecu, and he asked and said, Where are Samuel and David? And someone said, They are now at Naioth in Ramah. So he went there, toward Naioth in Ramah. And the Spirit of God came upon him as well, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes and also prophesied before Samuel, and he lay naked all that day and all that night. Therefore they say, Is Saul also among the prophets?